what supports prosperity, what supports democracy, and what supports liberty. And the key idea of the narrow corridor is that we need robust political participation from the people, and we need the state to play a pro-liberty, pro-prosperity role. In particular, for example, to create inclusive markets which have the right legal system, the right equality of opportunity, the right regulations against the powerful actors, the right type of public good provision, as I emphasize in the context of education and healthcare. But how do you get robust political participation? How do you get the state to play that role, both in terms of achieving the right capacity and using that capacity the right way? Some people may say, especially from the American audiences, oh, you need to have a better constitution. Well, Jim and I, don't attach much importance to that idea. We don't think you build inclusive markets or democracy or liberty via well-designed constitutions. Instead, it is about a dynamic process between the state and society. And here is a summary of it, simplifying things quite a bit. We put society's power on the horizontal axis, the power of the state on the vertical axis. So high-capacity states are on the vertical axis, well-organized societies that can solve the collective action problem via norms, traditions, small group interactions, civil society, parties, media are high up in the power of society. China would be here on the upper left quadrant. State is strong, society is weak. And you see, when that is the case, the dynamics are for further weakening of society, which is exactly what we are experiencing in China. You have many societies, in fact, the majority of human history has been under strong societies, in small-scale societies, for example, and weak states. But in the middle here, you have our narrow corridor, where power of the state and power of society are in balance, and you see something very different, qualitatively different. Now, what we call the shackled Leviathan can support freedom and prosperity, imperfectly albeit, but it's a dynamic process. And the arrows here are pointing upwards rather than to the left or down like this, which means that in this narrow corridor, you have a qualitatively different behavior. The potential cooperation, as well as the competition between state and society, is creating a dialectic process where both state and society can become stronger over time. The state takes on more responsibilities, more regulation, new institutions, while society becomes more and more vigilant via new institutions, via better organization of democracy, and so on. Remarkably, I would say, in contrast to the views that many political scientists have expressed, you don't get higher state capacity with despotic leviathans. This arrow here is going somewhere in the middle of the vertical axis, whereas this is growing here. And that's because the capacity of the state under cooperation with society is going to far exceed what you can achieve with just making people obey you by fiat, even with all of the brainwashing that China has invested in. Now, this framework provides a very different way of thinking about prosperity and freedom. You always have to fight for freedom. Freedom is never guaranteed because this corridor is narrow, so you can have shocks or changes that will take you out of it. But when things work, freedom and prosperity become self-reinforcing. It's a fragile state, but it is a self-reinforcing state. And it's something you cannot achieve by constitutions, because you need the true mobilization of society against elites and against power. And that's why inequality is so corrosive. If you have very high inequality, you cannot have limits to the power of elites. And this is what our framework emphasizes. And with the ancient Greeks, one of the early places where vibrant democracy was practiced, understood. So the Athenian Republic, for example, was a leader in introducing both new state institutions and new ways of controlling the state. Chief among them is quite emblematic of the forces that we emphasize. It's the institution of ostracism, which Cleisthenes introduced. Every year, the legislature would vote whether to have an ostracism. And if there is an ostracism, then all of the citizenry, the male citizens, unfortunately, women did not have the vote, male citizenry would vote who to ostracize. They would write the name of a person on a broken piece of shard, a shard of pottery called an ostrakon. That's where the name ostracism comes from. And whosever name was written there would get ostracized. They would be exiled from Athens for 10 years. So this is from the Themistocles' ostracism. Themistocles was as much of a hero as Athens has ever had. He saved Athens against the Persians, and he identified the Spartan threat early on. He was a brilliant orator and brilliant soldier and a statesperson. But at some point, he got too big for his britches, and he was exiled via this ostracism process. Now, this all asks a very obvious question. What determines the shape, the boundaries, the width of the narrow corridor? Where do high capacity states that can support liberty come from? In fact, this is asked in the language of the narrow corridor, but this question in different forms have been asked by many social scientists. They have suggested the nature of technology, war, or the threat of war. This is a very famous thesis by Charles Tilly, the famous political sociologist, when he said states made war and war made the state. Some kind of geographies are good for liberty or state's capacity, some crops or ownership structures, or some cultures, and so on and so forth. The problem is that when you look at history, you see as many places that support these theories as contradicted. So there are many places where the threat of war was associated with more state capacity, and many places in which the threat of war led to the collapse of state capacity. And in fact, this is where this literature got itself into big tangles, but our framework makes it clear why. So what is greater state capacity? You can think of it in this graph as an increase in the power of the state. But you can immediately see what it will do. There was greater state capacity in Montenegro against external threats from the Ottomans and from other European powers. That led to better monetary organization, but it didn't do anything to Montenegro because they were so far from the corridor, and the dynamics took Montenegro back towards weaker state after this. Prussia is the counterexample. As many people identified, including Voltaire, the state became subservient to the army. Why? Well, you can think of the Prussian history as being in the narrow corridor. They had a very strong parliament, but against the threat of war, especially after the 30-year war, Prussia strengthened its institutions, strengthened the state, weakened the parliament, weakened the rights of citizens, and according to our theory, Prussia went out of the corridor. But Switzerland is a brilliant example where the cantons had to organize and build a stronger state, and that was conducive to even faster increases in state capacity together with liberty. This framework also highlights that if we want to build prosperity and liberty around the world, there isn't a one-size-fits-all remedy for it. If you are with a despotic leviathan such as China, what you need is to increase the power of the state and perhaps weaken the power of the state. If you are in parts of sub-Saharan Africa where state capacity is very weak, what you need to do is strengthen state capacity. Or if you are in this region, what you need is a simultaneous increase in both state capacity and power of society to get into the corridor. But I want to conclude by highlighting that all of this has to play out against a context that's defined by external events. We don't live in a world in which domestic political economy can be conceptualized without what's going on around the world. The coronavirus changed dynamics in many ways. Many countries increased surveillance during the coronavirus, and those tools have not been rolled back. So it is not a surprise that the authoritarian impulse has gotten stronger in places diverse, such as Mexico, Turkey, Hungary, and so on. And the Russian and Chinese anti-democracy movement, I think, has gained much faster momentum with the descent of the Russian regime into greater violence and greater kleptocracy, as witnessed by the international crisis that has been triggered by the invasion of Ukraine. I think those highlight threats against democracy, and by nature of the framework that I am describing here, threats against freedom and prosperity that we are going to have to live with in the decades to come. But in my mind, it doesn't change the key elements that I try to introduce in this short talk. For prosperity and liberty, we need democratic institutions. Democratic institutions need the support of the people. And for that, democratic institutions need to deliver not just in terms of growth, but in terms of public goods, low inequality, control of corruption. All of this is much easier if we have this balance between state and society, in particular, the kind of balance that only comes from the mobilization of society so that people can be vigilant against all kinds of elites, be they dictators like Vladimir Putin or economic elites such as, Elon Musk or Sam Altman or other mega rich people. I think bottom-up participation against the powerful has to remain a key channel via which democracy, freedom, and prosperity have to be defended.